December 3rd, 1944, Eastern Lorraine. A thin winter mist drifts over the open fields, softening the edges of the frozen hearth. At the far end of a ridgeline, three dark silhouettes creep forward in disciplined formation. German armor. Their long barrels and sloped steel give them away even before the sun catches the first glint of frost on their hulls. Panthers. The tank the Wehrmacht believes no American gun can reliably touch from the front. Hidden nearly a mile away, an American tank destroyer platoon waits in absolute stillness. Engines off, crews pressed against cold metal. The gunners already have their sights fixed, the range markers set. They know the numbers. They know the odds. And they know that if they fire first, they might rewrite the battlefield assumptions of an entire army. The Panthers advance. Unaware, a gunner exhales. A shot breaks the morning.
The belief that the Panther was all but untouchable did not appear suddenly on the battlefields of Western Europe. It had been built over years of engineering ambition, battlefield adaptation, and the harsh lessons Germany drew from the Eastern Front. When the first Panthers rolled toward Kursk in July 1943, they represented a new philosophy of armored warfare. A tank designed not merely to defeat enemy armor, but to dominate at long range. Its 75mm KWK-42 gun could outrange most Allied weapons. Its sloped armor, inspired by careful study of the Soviet T-34, promised to shatter incoming rounds before they ever reached the fighting compartment. On paper, it was the perfect predator. And for a time, the reputation held. On the Eastern Front, Soviet crews often learned the hard way that the Panther could kill at distances where their own weapons struggled to respond. As surviving German tankers rotated west in 1943 and 1944, they carried with them the conviction that the Panther's frontal arc was effectively immune to anything the Western Allies possessed. This belief began spreading through German ranks even faster than the tanks themselves. Officers wrote it into tactical manuals. Crews repeated it to new recruits. Many entered battle certain that only carelessness, not firepower, could bring them down. Across the Channel, the U.S. Army had taken a very different path. American armored doctrine separated the roles of tank and tank destroyer, a concept that emphasized mobility, flanking fire, and rapid concentration of force. U.S. tanks like the M4 Sherman were intended to support infantry and exploit breakthroughs, not duel heavy German armor head-on. Anti-tank duties fell instead to specialized vehicles, open-topped, fast, and armed with high-velocity guns. The M10 Wolverine with its 3-inch gun was the first. The M18 Hellcat, light and astonishingly quick, followed. Lastly came the M36 Jackson, its 90mm gun capable, at least in theory, of punching through German armor at long range. By late 1944, these tank destroyers had found their way onto every major front in Western Europe, their crews trained not for close-quarter brawls, but for range finding, terrain exploitation, and disciplined, deliberate firing. They learned to use ridge lines, to calculate angles, to wait for the enemy to expose a weakness. They understood the Panther's strengths, but they also studied its flaws: a vulnerable lower plate, a mechanically slow turret, and side armor far thinner than its imposing front suggested. Still, the myth persisted. Germans believed their Panthers were invulnerable. Many Americans believed the same. Yet the winter battles of 1944 would test these assumptions. As the front line stretched across France and into Germany, long-range engagements became increasingly common, and the tank destroyers that many had doubted were about to show exactly what their guns could do.
By the final months of 1944, the battlefields of Western Europe had transformed into the ideal proving ground for long-range armored combat. The hedgerows of Normandy were behind the advancing American armies. In their place stretched wide, rolling farmland, broken by ridge lines, tree lines, and shallow valleys. Terrain that rewarded the first shot, the first sighting, the first crew to recognize how distance could become a weapon. For the Panther, designed for these open fields, it seemed like a return to its intended environment. For American tank destroyers, it was the moment their doctrine had quietly anticipated. German planners believed the Western Allies would struggle to match their optical range-finding and long-barrel accuracy. The Panther's gunner, peering through some of the finest sights of the war, could confidently engage a target at 1,500 yards or more. U.S. tank optics, while adequate, were not as refined. On paper, that advantage should have translated directly into battlefield dominance. Yet reality held variables that paper analysis never captured: weather, smoke, camouflage, and the sheer difficulty of spotting a well-concealed enemy before he fired. By late 1944, the German army faced shortages that no amount of engineering excellence could overcome. Fuel was scarce. Training programs had been shortened. Newly arrived Panther crews often lacked the veteran experience that made early encounters so lethal. And critically, Germany no longer dictated the terms of engagement. Allied air power forced Panthers to move cautiously, often at night, and to occupy defensive positions rather than maneuver aggressively across open terrain. The tank that had been designed to strike first now increasingly had to absorb the first shot instead. Meanwhile, American tank doctrine grew sharper through experience. Tank destroyer battalions had learned to use their mobility not as a symbolic trait, but as a tactical truth. A Hellcat or an M36 didn't need to be heavily armored if it could choose where to fight, how to fight, and most importantly, when to fire. Many engagements in France and Lorraine began with U.S. TD crews identifying German armor at long distance and preparing firing solutions before the Panthers even realized they were being observed. The mathematics of armor penetration played a crucial role. The Panther's frontal plate was formidable, but not unbreakable. At the right angle, from a stable position, and with the velocity of a high-grade American AP round, penetrations at 1,200 to 1,800 yards were not only possible, they were increasingly proven in combat. Reports from tank destroyer battalions noted hits that struck the turret ring, the mantle seam, or the edges of the glacis where the slope diminished effective thickness. The stage was set for a confrontation that neither side fully expected. The Germans approached with the confidence of their engineering legacy. The Americans waited with the precision of their emerging battlefield doctrine. Everything was in motion toward a moment when reputation would meet reality.
To understand why the myth of Panther invulnerability endured for so long, one must begin with the perspective of the men who operated it. German crews believed deeply in the superiority of their machine, and not without reason. The Panther's sloped glacis, 80 millimeters thick, but effectively much greater due to its angle, offered protection unmatched by most Allied tanks in 1944. Its long 75-millimeter gun could destroy Shermans well before American crews could strike back. Veterans from the Eastern Front carried vivid memories of engagements where Panthers picked off Soviet armor at ranges so distant that many opponents never even spotted the source of fire. For these tankers, the idea that an American gun, especially one mounted on a lightly armored, open-topped vehicle, could penetrate their frontal armor at a mile's distance felt almost absurd. Embedded in this confidence was a broader German belief in qualitative superiority. By late 1944, as material and manpower shortages mounted, German doctrine leaned increasingly on the assumption that better weapons could offset dwindling numbers. Panther battalions were often positioned at critical points in the defensive line. Their presence intended not only to blunt Allied offensives, but to project psychological dominance. Many commanders wrote in their journals that the Panther was the last armored guarantee Germany possessed, a machine capable of restoring the initiative even as the strategic situation collapsed. But this perspective overlooked the subtle vulnerabilities that experienced tank destroyer crews recognized. The Panther had excellent frontal armor, yet its sides were comparatively thin. Its long, heavy gun made rapid traverse difficult, especially on uneven ground, and its large silhouette, while imposing, made concealment challenging in broken terrain. German crews accustomed to engaging from prepared positions often believed they controlled the engagement. In reality, the shifting conditions of late 1944 increasingly favored those who mastered mobility and first sighting rather than static defense. From the American side, the view was different, shaped by doctrine, training, and the relentless learning curve of combat. Tank destroyer crews entered the war knowing they would face heavier and better armored opponents. Their vehicles lacked the thick protection of tanks, but they compensated through speed, silhouette, and optics designed for quick, accurate firing. Many TD battalions studied German armor layouts extensively. Crews memorized weak points, angles of attack, and the distances at which their guns could reliably penetrate. They learned to fight as hunters, not as duelists. A critical difference lay in mindset. U.S. tank destroyer doctrine emphasized ambush, maneuver, and rapid concentration of fire. Crews trained to identify terrain that offered distant lines of sight. Very geography Panthers were expected to dominate. Instead of engaging head-on, TD units learned to position themselves where their first shot carried decisive weight. They understood that Panther commanders expected close-range battles where their armor advantage was absolute. American gunners intended to deny them that comfort. By late 1944, battalion reports noted growing confidence. M18 crews spoke of the satisfaction of outmaneuvering heavier tanks. M36 crews, equipped with the powerful 90mm gun, practiced shots at distances previously considered academic. As more long-range kills were recorded, U.S. tank destroyers began proving that technical superiority did not always dictate battlefield truth. Perspective by perspective, the myth of the Panther's invulnerability began to erode, though its final collapse would come only after the crucible of direct engagement.
While German crews clung to the belief that their Panthers were shielded by engineering superiority, American tank destroyer battalions were developing a quieter, more pragmatic confidence. Their strength did not lie in armor thickness or gun length. It lay in doctrine, a doctrine that, when applied with discipline, could neutralize even the most formidable opponent. Tank destroyer commanders understood that the battlefield rarely rewarded brute force alone. It rewarded those who saw first, fired first, and struck where the enemy was least prepared. For U.S. crews, the engagement began long before the first shot. Scouts scanned ridgelines, tree gaps, and road approaches. Range estimates were practiced constantly. Every man in the platoon needed to know the capabilities of his gun, the behavior of the ammunition, and the angles where German armor lost its invulnerability. The 3-inch gun of the M10 and the 76mm of the M18 Hellcat demanded precision at long range, but the M36 Jackson's 90mm gun introduced a new dimension, penetrative power that, under the right conditions, made even the Panther's glasses vulnerable. American crews viewed distance as an ally. The farther the gap, the more time they had to adjust for wind, recoil, and target movement. More importantly, the Panther's true weakness, its slow turret traverse, became increasingly pronounced at range. A Panther forced to pivot its entire hull to track a distant, elusive target became an easier mark. Even a momentary pause, a slight misjudgment, or a turn across the line of fire could expose a flank plate that no amount of German confidence could protect. Frontline accounts reveal how these principles translated into battlefield reality. In Lorraine, Hellcat crews described waiting silently on ridge crests as Panthers approached across open fields, unaware they were being targeted from over a mile away. At Aracourt, after-action reports document multiple Panther kills at distances exceeding 1,500 yards, shots that struck either the mantlet's curved edges or the narrow band beneath the glacis where slope lost its advantage. Gunners spoke of these engagements not with bravado, but with a matter-of-fact clarity that reflected training rather than luck. German perspectives on these encounters were markedly different. Many Panther commanders reported being hit without ever locating the source of fire. Others mistook tank destroyers for standard Shermans, assuming they could close the distance and rely on superior frontal protection. Instead, they found themselves immobilized before their guns even settled on target. As these incidents multiplied, German armored officers began questioning long-held assumptions. The Panther was still formidable, but it was no longer a guarantee.
A final angle emerges from the technological contrast itself. German optics were superb, but they relied on visibility and time, resources increasingly scarce on a battlefield shaped by Allied artillery and air power. American tank destroyers, though equipped with simpler sights, compensated through faster target acquisition and better synchronization between commander, gunner, and driver. What the Germans framed as inferior equipment was in practice a system optimized for quick, coordinated fire. These perspectives converged in the winter battles of 1944. One side approached believing its armor made it untouchable. The other approached knowing that range, patience, and calculated fire could overcome even the most feared machine. The moment these two convictions met would mark the turning point of the Panther's reputation.
The breaking point of the Panther's reputation arrived not through a single dramatic duel, but through a series of engagements that unfolded with the cold precision of trained gunners and the harsh vulnerability of armored steel meeting high-velocity fire. Among these, the fighting around Aracourt in September 1944 became the clearest demonstration that American tank destroyers, when properly positioned, could reach out far beyond what German commanders believed possible. It was here, across long fields soaked with morning fog and late summer rain, that U.S. crews achieved the long-range hits that would overturn months of German confidence. The terrain near Aracourt offered exactly the conditions tank destroyer doctrine had been built for. Low ridge lines, shallow valleys, and open fields stretched for hundreds of yards in every direction, a landscape that rewarded the first crew to recognize a silhouette on the horizon. The German 111th Panzer Brigade entered the area, expecting to overwhelm American positions with superior firepower and frontal resilience. Their Panthers advanced cautiously, believing they possessed both reach and survivability. But the U.S. 4th Armored Division and attached tank destroyer battalions had spent days studying these approaches. They knew where German armor would likely appear. They knew the contours that would expose an advancing tank's hull before its turret could clear the ridge. And most importantly, they knew where they could fire from complete concealment. On the morning of September 19, visibility lifted just enough for American observers to spot dark shapes moving between the hedge lines nearly a mile away. They recognized the tall profile, the long barrel, the broad sloped armor. Panthers, perhaps a dozen of them. The order passed quickly down the line. M18 Hellcats maneuvered into position, engines throttled low, hulls angled carefully to reduce their own exposure. Some crews lay in wait on reverse slopes. Others nestled behind haystacks, trees, or the broken remains of farm buildings. What followed was a duel measured not in minutes, but in seconds. The first Hellcat gunner watched through his sight as a Panther crested a distant ridge. At roughly 1,500 yards, the target was small, the margin for error unforgiving. But the principles drilled into every tank destroyer battalion, range estimation, wind judgment, and calm trigger control guided the shot. The gun thundered. A second later, a sharp flash appeared beneath the Panther's mantlet. The tank lurched, halted, then began smoking as its crew scrambled to escape. Across the line, other American guns opened fire. Panthers attempted to traverse toward the threat, but the distance worked against them. Their turrets moved slowly, and the U.S. vehicles were already repositioning, firing again, relocating, and striking before the Germans could fully respond. Several Panthers were hit, while still unaware of how far away their attackers actually were. German after-action reports later noted that crews believed they were being attacked by Shermans at close range. They couldn't imagine American guns reaching them from beyond 1,000 yards with such effect, yet the evidence burned across the fields of Aracourt. Turret rings shattered, glacis plates cracked at their seams, engines ignited by precise long-distance fire. This engagement marked the first time many German units realized that the Panther's frontal armor was not invincible. The combination of American concealment, disciplined gunnery, and the penetrating power of the 76mm and 90mm guns overturned assumptions that had shaped German armored planning for more than a year. But Aracourt was only the beginning. As autumn turned toward winter, long-range duels became more frequent. Each one revealed more weaknesses, more cracks in the myth,
More moments when German crews discovered that the feared range of the Panther was now matched and sometimes surpassed by the very forces they had underestimated. The decisive moment, the engagement that would fully collapse the illusion of Panther invulnerability, was approaching.
The collapse of the Panther's aura of invulnerability reached its defining moment as winter settled across the Western Front. Snow muffled engine noise. Frozen ground amplified the shock of every impact. In the still air of December 1944, American tank destroyer units found themselves facing German armored thrusts that relied heavily, sometimes desperately, on the Panther's assumed dominance in long-range engagements. What unfolded in these battles revealed the truth the German High Command had not anticipated. The battlefield no longer belonged to the side with the thickest armor, but to the side that understood how to turn distance, patience, and concealment into decisive force. One engagement in particular captured this turning point. Near the small French village of Singling, south of the Saar River, elements of the U.S. 37th Tank Battalion and detached tank destroyers were positioned along a series of low hills overlooking open fields. German reconnaissance had identified the terrain as favorable for armored assault. Panthers from the 11th Panzer Division moved forward with confidence, fully expecting that any American vehicle caught in the open would be unable to penetrate them from the front. The Americans were not in the open. M36 Jacksons had taken up positions behind the crest of a ridge, their barrels angled downward just enough to remain concealed. Snow clung to their hulls, blurring their outlines against the white landscape. Range calculations were scribbled in notebooks. Wind adjustments were whispered between commander and gunner. The crews waited, disciplined and still, as the Panthers advanced. At 1,400 to 1,600 yards, the German tanks slowed. For them, this was ideal firing distance, well beyond what they believed American guns could match. One Panther rotated slightly, preparing to engage what it assumed would be short-range Shermans on the reverse slope. The first M36 fired. The 90mm shell crossed the frozen air and struck the Panther not on the center of the glacis, as German armor theorists feared, but at the narrow band beneath it, the shot trap, where slope diminished and plate met angle. The round tore through the front, disabling the tank instantly. Its crew bailed out into the snow, stunned that they had been hit at all, let alone from beyond the range they believed the Americans were capable of. Before the Panthers could adjust, a second M36 fired from a slightly different angle. Another long-range hit, this time into the mantlet seam. A third shot followed from farther down the line, striking the side armor of a tank attempting to turn toward the threat. Within moments, 3 Panthers were burning or immobilized, all destroyed by precise fire from distances they had not prepared for. German commanders in the sector reported the experience with rare candor. Several Panther crews stated they never located the American firing positions. Others insisted the shots must have been fired by tank destroyers much closer than after-action maps later confirmed. The idea that open-topped, lightly armored U.S. vehicles had defeated Panthers from over 1,500 yards was, to many, inconceivable. Yet the evidence surrounded them. For the Americans, the engagement became a validation of everything their doctrine demanded: coordinated fire, rapid repositioning, disciplined range estimation, and an unshakable understanding of enemy vulnerabilities. After each shot, the M36s shifted slightly, denying German gunners a fixed target. The ridge concealed their movements. Snow absorbed the sound of their engines. The range gave them time, the one resource Panthers needed but no longer possessed. By the time the German advance halted, several Panthers lay disabled across the field, their long barrels pointed uselessly toward a threat they never fully perceived. This was the moment when the myth finally shattered. The Panther, once viewed as an unstoppable force on the battlefield, had been defeated not by overwhelming numbers or brute firepower, but by the tactical discipline of crews who understood how to apply their weapons at the edge of their range envelope. The Panther's legend had met the reality of U.S. tank destroyer doctrine, and it had failed.
When the smoke settled over the winter fields of Lorraine and the Saar, The battlefield told a story that contradicted months of German confidence. Panthers lay burned or abandoned across the open ground, not victims of close-range flank shots, but of long-distance fire delivered with precision and patience. For American commanders, the significance was immediate. For the German High Command, it was unsettling. And for the crews who fought inside those steel machines, it marked the end of an assumption that had shaped their tactics since Kursk. Initial after-action reports from U.S. tank destroyer battalions were clear. Long-range engagements were no longer theoretical. They were becoming routine. Units recorded hits at 1,200, 1,400, even 1,600 yards, distances once believed beyond the reach of American guns. These were not isolated successes. They were part of a growing pattern in which M18 Hellcats, M10s, and especially M36 Jacksons consistently disrupted German armored thrusts before Panthers could bring their own optics and firepower to bear. The data challenged long-standing beliefs on both sides. American crews, once wary of confronting German heavy armor frontally, gained confidence in their ability to control the terms of an engagement. They understood that their advantage did not come from thickness of steel, but from initiative, terrain, and the ability to strike first. Panther crews were discovering the opposite, that the armor they trusted could not guarantee survival against a foe who used distance as a weapon rather than a vulnerability. German commanders soon realized that Panther losses were not only increasing, but occurring under conditions they had never planned for. Reports from armored units near Aracourt, Singling, and throughout Lorraine described tanks disabled before firing a single shot. Some Panthers were hit while still maneuvering into position. Others were destroyed by rounds that exploited structural seams, shot traps, and angles where slope no longer provided protection. The myth of Panther invulnerability had not simply been damaged, it had been disproven under the most unforgiving measure: combat. For American forces, these lessons reshaped operational thinking. Tank destroyer battalions began coordinating more closely with reconnaissance units, artillery observers, and armored divisions. Terrain analysis grew sharper. Firing points were selected not for proximity, but for visibility. The ability to strike a Panther before it recognized the threat became a strategic asset, one that commanders at every level sought to maximize as the war pushed toward the German border. By early 1945, the Panther was still dangerous, still capable, still respected, but it no longer inspired the awe or fear it once had. Its armor was no longer seen as a barrier. It was seen as a challenge that American gunners had already learned how to meet and overcome. The consequences of this shift would deepen in the months that followed.
As the Allied advance continued into early 1945, the repercussions of the Panthers' diminished reputation rippled across the front. German armor doctrine, long anchored in the belief that superior engineering could offset shrinking manpower and fuel reserves, found itself increasingly misaligned with battlefield reality. The Panthers still posed a threat. No knowledgeable American tanker dismissed them lightly, but they no longer carried the aura of untouchability that had once shaped German operational planning. American intelligence sections began compiling statistical analyses drawn from tank destroyer battalions, armored divisions, and infantry units that had encountered Panthers during the campaigns in France and Germany. The numbers painted a consistent picture. A significant portion of Panther losses in late 1944 and early 1945 resulted from long-range hits delivered by U.S. tank destroyers and Shermans armed with the 76mm gun. Penetrations at 1,200 to 1,500 yards were recorded frequently enough to no longer be considered exceptional. Even the frontal armor, once believed to be proof against anything the Americans fielded, showed vulnerabilities when hit with the 90mm ammunition of the M36 Jackson, or armor-piercing rounds delivered from stable, well-prepared firing positions. These findings altered the way American commanders approached the final push into Germany. Instead of treating Panther sightings as emergencies requiring overwhelming force, they were increasingly met with deliberate fire plans.
Recon units called in tank destroyers to set up long-range kill zones. Artillery observers coordinated smoke to channel German armor into exposed approaches. In this system, the Panther was not a monster to be avoided, but a target to be neutralized through coordination and calculated gunnery. The psychological shift among American crews was profound. No longer did the sight of a Panther's silhouette trigger the fear it had in Normandy. Instead, it prompted a practice sequence of actions, tested repeatedly in the battles of Lorraine and the Saar. For German crews, the shift was equally profound, but far more demoralizing. Combat diaries from late 1944 described growing frustration as Panthers were lost to shots fired from distances the crews had believed safe. Many wrote of never seeing the enemy responsible. Others recorded instances where their tanks were hit before they could rotate their heavy turrets toward the threat. A few survived engagements, only to learn afterward that their opponents had been open-topped American vehicles, a revelation that challenged everything they had been taught about armor, firepower, and battlefield dominance. Strategically, the loss of Panther superiority eroded one of the Wehrmacht's last remaining advantages in armored warfare. As fuel shortages worsened and experienced crews became harder to replace, Germany could no longer rely on its tanks to dictate the terms of engagement. The Americans had adapted, and adaptation, not raw engineering, was shaping the outcome. By the time Allied forces reached the Rhine, the Panther still appeared in German counterattacks, still fought hard, and still damaged many American vehicles. But its legend had faded. The battlefield had revealed the truth. No tank is invincible, and no reputation survives untested steel. With the myth stripped away, only one question remained. What lessons would history draw from this shift?
The story of the Panther and the American tank destroyers is not merely a comparison of steel, armor, and firepower. It is a reminder of how quickly certainty can dissolve under the weight of real combat. The Panther was a marvel of engineering, powerful, well-armed, and formidable when handled by trained crews. But war does not honor theory. It tests machines in mud, in fog, in snow, under pressure and against opponents who adapt faster than expectations allow. For the Americans, the triumph at long range was not the result of superior armor or a more imposing weapon. It grew from doctrine, discipline, and an understanding that mobility and preparation could overcome even the strongest defenses. The tank destroyer crews who waited in the cold, who studied the angles and memorized the distances, proved that precision and initiative could shift the balance in a way raw thickness of steel could not. For the Germans, the Panther's decline was not a failure of design, but a failure to recognize that confidence is not a shield. A tank's reputation cannot protect it from a well-placed shot across an open field. By the winter of 1944, the myth of invincibility had met the reality of evolving tactics, and it could not endure. History's lesson is quiet but enduring. No weapon remains untouchable once the enemy understands its limits. The side that adapts, that questions its assumptions, refines its methods, and learns from every engagement, ultimately shapes the course of battle. The winter duels of 1944 revealed this truth with every shot that crossed the frozen air.